Welcome to the world of medieval Europe, a time of stone, shadow, and iron will. The year is somewhere in the 10,000s, and across the continent from the cold hills of England to the sun-baked plains of southern France, something extraordinary is happening. People are building upward. They are carving into mountains, stacking stone upon stone, and raising structures so massive, so imposing, that even 1,000 years later, their ruins still make us stop and stare. Today we are going inside those structures. We are going into the dungeons beneath the earth, climbing the towers that scrape the medieval sky, and walking the walls of the fortresses that shaped the fate of nations. This is not a story about kings sitting on golden thrones. This is a story about stone, fear, power, and survival. Let us begin where most people would rather not go. Underground. In the popular imagination, the dungeon is a place of horror, a dark pit filled with chains, rats, and forgotten prisoners. And while that image is not entirely wrong, the reality of the medieval dungeon in the 1000s is actually far more interesting and far more complex than a simple torture chamber. The word dungeon itself comes from the old French word donjon, and here is the twist that surprises most people. The donjon was not originally underground at all. In the early medieval period, the donjon referred to the main tower of a castle, the Great Tower, the most important and most fortified structure in the entire complex. It was the heart of the castle. It was where the lord lived, where the treasures were kept, where the last defenders would retreat when all else failed. Over time, as castle design evolved, the term shifted and people began using it to describe the basement levels of these great towers, the lowest and most secure spaces, which were then used for storage and, yes, for holding prisoners. But in the 1000s, we are right at the beginning of that transition, and the donjon in this era is primarily a symbol of power and dominance. Think about what it meant to build one of these structures in the early 11th century. There were no cranes, no modern machinery, no reinforced concrete. Everything was done by hand, by human muscle, by oxen and horses, by ropes and pulleys and wooden scaffolding. The stone had to be quarried, often miles away, transported across difficult terrain, and then shaped and set in place by skilled craftsmen called masons. A single castle could take years or even decades to complete. It required enormous resources, enormous organization, and enormous wealth. Only the most powerful lords could afford to build in stone at all. Many of the fortifications of the early 1000s were still made primarily of wood, earthworks, and timber palisades. The stone castle was a statement. It said, "I am here, I am permanent, and I am not going anywhere." The most common form of castle in this period was the motte and bailey design. The motte was an artificial mound of earth, raised up from the ground, sometimes quite dramatically, with a wooden or stone tower built on top of it. The bailey was an enclosed courtyard at the base of the motte, protected by a wooden fence or palisade and often surrounded by a ditch or moat. This design was enormously practical. It could be built relatively quickly compared to a full stone fortress. It made effective use of the natural landscape, and it gave defenders a significant height advantage over any attackers. The Normans, who would go on to conquer England in 1066, were masters of the motte and bailey castle, and they built them across France, England, and later across southern Italy and Sicily as they expanded their power. If you have ever stood at the base of a castle mound and looked up at the tower above you, you have felt what the people of the 1000s felt when they looked at one of these structures for the first time. A mixture of awe, respect, and if you happen to be on the wrong side of the lord who built it, genuine fear. Now let us talk about towers, because in medieval Europe of the 1000s, towers were everywhere and they meant everything. There were watchtowers on hillsides, sending signals across vast distances. There were bell towers on churches, calling the faithful to prayer and warning communities of approaching danger. There were gate towers flanking the entrances to fortified towns, housing the guards who controlled who could enter and who could not. And there were the great towers of the castles themselves, the keeps, the donjons, the square and round and polygonal masses of stone that defined the skyline of medieval Europe, just as skyscrapers define our skylines today. To understand medieval towers, you have to understand the fundamental logic of height. Height meant visibility. Height meant a longer range for archers and defenders. Height meant that an attacker had to work upward against gravity, which made every step of an assault more difficult and more costly. Height also meant prestige. A taller tower could be seen from further away, which meant that more people knew of your power, feared your strength, and understood your dominance over the surrounding land. The square keep was the dominant form of tower in the thousands, particularly in England and Normandy. These were massive rectangular structures, often several stories tall, with walls that could be 3 or 4 meters thick at the base. The thickness of the walls was not just about defense against battering rams and siege engines, though it served that purpose well. It was also about structural integrity. Building tall in stone requires enormous weight at the base, and those thick walls distributed the load of the upper stories down into the foundations. Inside a square keep, the layout was typically quite functional. The ground floor might be used for storage, perhaps grain or weapons or wine. The first floor above ground level would often house the Great Hall, where the Lord held court, received guests, and conducted the business of governing his lands. Above that might be the Lord's private chambers, and at the very top, the battlements, the crenellated parapet from which defenders could rain down arrows, rocks, boiling water, or burning oil on anyone foolish enough to attack. The stairways inside these towers were deliberately narrow and wound in a clockwise direction when viewed from above. This was not accidental. A right-handed attacker climbing a clockwise spiral staircase would find his sword arm constantly pressing against the central pillar, limiting his ability to swing. A right-handed defender coming down the same staircase would have his sword arm free and open. These towers were designed with violence in mind, every single element of them. One of the most remarkable towers of this entire period was the White Tower at the Tower of London. Built by William the Conqueror beginning in 1078, it stands as one of the finest examples of Norman military architecture in existence. Its walls are nearly 4 meters thick in places. It rises to a height of about 27 meters. And inside, in addition to the practical spaces of storage and great hall and private chambers, there is a chapel, the Chapel of St. John the Evangelist, one of the most perfectly preserved examples of Romanesque architecture in England. Even in a structure built primarily for war and intimidation, the people of the 1000s found space for beauty and for God. That combination, the sacred and the martial, the spiritual and the military, runs through almost everything built in medieval Europe during this period. But towers were not only found inside castles. Some of the most fascinating towers of the thousands were built by wealthy merchant families in Italian cities, particularly in places like Bologna, Florence, and San Gimignano. These were private family towers, sometimes dozens of them crowded together in a single urban neighborhood rising 40, 50, 60 meters or more into the air. Why did wealthy families build these towers in cities where there was no military frontier to defend? The answer lies in the politics of medieval Italian city life. Italy in the 1000s was a place of intense factional conflict. Different noble families were constantly at war with each other, fighting for control of city governments, trade routes, and local power. In this environment, your tower was your fortress. If a rival family came after you, you retreated into your tower and held out until the attack passed or negotiations were reached. The height of your tower also directly communicated your status and your wealth. A taller tower meant a more powerful family. This led to a kind of arms race of altitude, with families competing to build higher and higher, until city governments eventually began passing laws restricting the maximum height of private towers. The forest of towers that once dominated the skylines of Italian medieval cities has mostly disappeared. But in San Gimignano, 14 of these towers still stand, and walking among them today gives you a visceral sense of what medieval urban life among the powerful could look like. Now we come to the fortresses, the great defensive complexes that were not just single buildings, but entire systems of walls, towers, gates, moats, and carefully designed killing grounds intended to make any attack as costly and as difficult as possible. A true fortress in the 1000s was a marvel of engineering and strategic thinking. The people who designed these structures did not have access to modern military science, but they were not unsophisticated. They had centuries of accumulated knowledge about what worked and what did not, drawn from Roman traditions, from Byzantine military manuals, from painful experience of sieges won and lost. A well-designed fortress in this period would typically be built on high ground if at all possible, giving defenders the advantage of elevation. It would be surrounded by one or more walls, often with a ditch or moat outside the outermost wall to keep siege engines at a distance. The walls themselves would be punctuated by towers at regular intervals, because a flat wall has blind spots directly at its base where attackers can work relatively sheltered from defenders above. Towers projecting out from the wall allowed defenders to shoot along the face of the wall and eliminate those blind spots. Gates were the most vulnerable points in any defensive wall, and gate design in this period reflects serious thought about that vulnerability. A gate might be approached through a barbican, an outer defensive work that forced attackers to navigate a narrow passage under fire from defenders on both sides before even reaching the main gate. The gate itself might have a portcullis, a heavy iron-reinforced wooden grille that could be dropped rapidly to block the entrance. And above the gateway passage there might be holes in the ceiling called murder holes or meurtrières, through which defenders could pour boiling water, drop stones, or shoot arrows down onto any attacker who managed to get through the portcullis. One of the most impressive fortresses of the thousands was Carcassonne in southern France. Although much of what stands today represents later rebuilding and the rather heavy-handed restoration work of the 19th century architect Eugène Viollet-le-Duc, the core of Carcassonne's defenses follows patterns established in the early medieval period. The city sits on a hilltop overlooking the surrounding plain, surrounded by double walls with towers at intervals, designed to make any direct assault extraordinarily costly. To stand on the walls of Carcassonne today, looking out over the landscape, is to begin to understand how people of the medieval period thought about space and power and security. Everything is visible from those walls. Every road, every approach, every potentially threatening movement in the surrounding countryside could be observed and responded to by the garrison within. Another extraordinary example of fortress building in this period comes from the Byzantine Empire, which in the thousands still controlled significant territories in southeastern Europe, Anatolia, and the eastern Mediterranean. Byzantine military architecture was in many ways more sophisticated than what was being built in Western Europe at the same time. The Byzantines had maintained a continuous tradition of fortification building going back to Rome, and they had developed highly refined techniques for constructing walls, towers, and gates. The Theodosian walls of Constantinople, built in the 5th century but maintained and modified throughout the Byzantine period, are perhaps the most formidable urban defenses ever constructed in the ancient and medieval world. 3 lines of walls, the outermost backed by a wide moat, then a lower outer wall with towers, then the massive main wall with towers rising up to 20 meters high. These walls protected Constantinople for over 1,000 years, repelling countless sieges until the Ottoman conquest of 1453. In the 1000s, they were still in their prime, a monument to what human ingenuity and determination could achieve in stone. But let us step back for a moment from the grand scale of famous fortresses and famous towers and think about what life inside these places was actually like for the ordinary people who lived and worked in them. Because these were not empty military installations. They were homes, workplaces, communities. A large castle in the 1000s might house not just the lord and his family, but a significant population of knights, soldiers, servants, craftsmen, priests, cooks, stable hands, and a dozen other categories of people, all performing the essential functions that kept the castle running. The Great Hall was the social and administrative center of this community. It was where meals were eaten, where disputes were settled, where news was received, where entertainment was provided on feast days. The smell of a medieval Great Hall in constant use would have been extraordinary, a mixture of wood smoke from the central hearth, the smell of food being prepared, the odor of animals and unwashed bodies, rushes and herbs strewn on the floor to absorb the inevitable mess of daily life. Medieval people were not as uniformly dirty and unhygienic as later caricatures suggest, but they also did not have running water, flush toilets, or modern ventilation. And the reality of life in these enclosed stone spaces would have been pungent by any modern standard. The dungeons, meaning the actual basement levels of these towers and castles, served multiple practical functions beyond just holding prisoners. In many cases, they were primarily used as storage areas for food, weapons, and valuables. The thick stone walls and underground or semi-underground location kept these spaces cool in summer and relatively insulated in winter, making them effective natural refrigerators and storerooms. Prisoners were certainly held in these spaces as well. particularly high-value prisoners who might be ransomed back to their families or their lords. The practice of taking noble prisoners alive rather than killing them in battle was economically rational in this period. A live noble was worth a large ransom. A dead one was worth nothing except perhaps his weapons and horse. So castle dungeons in the 1000s would often have housed men of relatively high social status, kept in uncomfortable but not necessarily torturous conditions while negotiations for their release proceeded. The genuine horror of medieval imprisonment was more likely to be reserved for common criminals and people who had no political or economic value, who might indeed be kept in conditions that we would find appalling, with little food, no light, no sanitation, and no prospect of release. The development of castle architecture in the thousands was also deeply intertwined with the social and political system we call feudalism. Under the feudal system, land was held in exchange for military service. A king granted land to powerful lords, who in turn granted portions of that land to lesser lords and knights, who in return owed military service to those above them in the hierarchy. The castle was the physical embodiment of this system. It was the seat of local power, the administrative center of a lord's territory, the military base from which he could project force, and the refuge to which he could retreat when threatened. To build a castle was to assert lordship over a landscape. To destroy a castle was to break that lordship. This is why sieges were so central to medieval warfare. You did not win a medieval war simply by defeating an army in the field. If the defeated lord retreated to a strong castle with sufficient supplies, he could hold out for months or even years, and the effort required to starve him out or break down his walls might prove more costly than the victory was worth. Siege warfare in the 1000s was a complex and resource-intensive business. The attacker had several options available. The simplest and most common was simply to surround the castle, cut off its supplies, and wait. A castle garrison that ran out of food would eventually have to surrender or attempt a breakout. But this could take a very long time, and maintaining a large army in the field for months was itself enormously expensive and logistically challenging. A faster but riskier approach was direct assault. Attackers might try to scale the walls with ladders, breach the walls with a battering ram protected by a wooden shed called a penthouse or tortoise, or undermine the walls by digging tunnels beneath the foundations. This last technique, called sapping, was particularly effective against square towers with straight walls and sharp corners, because the corners were structurally vulnerable and a well-placed tunnel could bring an entire section of wall crashing down. This is one of the reasons that round towers began to replace square towers as castle design evolved through the 12th and 13th centuries. A round tower has no sharp corners to undermine and presents a curved surface that deflects both missiles and tunneling attempts more effectively than a flat wall. The defenders were not passive in all of this. They might attempt sorties, rushing out from the castle gates to attack siege works and siege engines before retreating back behind their walls. They might attempt to negotiate, to buy time, to seek relief from an allied force. They might engage in psychological warfare, displaying strength and confidence even when resources were running low, in hopes of convincing the attacker that the siege was not worth continuing. And they might engage in the dark arithmetic of survival, calculating how long their food would last against how much longer the attacker was likely to maintain the siege, and making the grim decision of whether to expel the non-combatants, the women, children, servants, and elderly who consumed food without contributing to the defense. This practice, known as putting out the useless mouths, was considered acceptable by the military conventions of the period, though it was brutal in its human consequences. As the 1000s progressed and the century moved toward its close, castle architecture began to evolve in response to experience and changing military technology. The introduction of new siege weapons, improved crossbows, and more sophisticated techniques for undermining and breaching walls drove a continuous cycle of improvement in defensive architecture. Walls grew thicker, towers became more numerous and more carefully positioned. Gate complexes became more elaborate. The simple motte and bailey of the early 11th century began to give way to more complex arrangements of stone walls and towers that would eventually develop into the great concentric castles of the 13th and 14th centuries. But the fundamental logic remained the same throughout. The logic that had driven human beings to build defensive structures since the earliest days of organized society. Height, mass, and stone deployed with intelligence and determination, could protect the people inside from the violence of the world outside. There is one more dimension to these structures that we have not yet fully explored, and that is their symbolic and psychological dimension. A castle, a tower, a fortress in medieval Europe was not just a military installation. It was a statement about the nature of reality, about who had power and who did not, about the relationship between the human and the divine, about the permanence of certain social arrangements and the transience of others. When a Norman lord built a great stone tower in the middle of newly conquered English territory after 1066, he was not just creating a military strongpoint. He was making a statement to every English person who could see it that the world had changed, that a new order had arrived and that it was built in stone and was not going anywhere. The psychological impact of these structures on the populations around them was profound and deliberate. They were designed to impress, to intimidate, and to inspire a sense of awe that shaded into submission. And yet, ironically, many of these structures also inspired something else, a sense of collective identity and pride. The fortress that protected your town, the tower that marked your lord's seat of power, the castle walls behind which your community could shelter in times of danger, these became landmarks in the deepest sense of the word. They marked the land. They defined the landscape. They became points of orientation and identity around which communities organized their understanding of space and belonging. The ruins of medieval fortresses and towers still perform something like this function today. They draw visitors from around the world, not just out of historical curiosity, but because there is something in these massive stone structures that speaks to something deep in human experience. The desire to endure, to leave something permanent in an impermanent world, to build high enough that you can see clearly and be clearly seen. In the 1000s, across the hills and plains and river valleys of medieval Europe, thousands of men and women worked their entire lives in the shadow of these structures. They cut the stone and shaped it. They carried it and set it in place. They cooked the food that fed the workers and the garrison. They kept watch from the towers through cold nights and hot days. They raised children who grew up thinking of stone walls as the natural boundaries of the world. And in doing so, they created something that outlasted them by a millennium, a landscape of towers and fortresses that we are still trying fully to understand, still trying fully to appreciate, still marveling at when we stand at the base of one of these ancient walls and look up at the sky above us. That is the story of medieval Europe's dungeons, towers, and fortresses in the thousands. Not just a story of war and power, though it is certainly that, but a story of human ambition, human fear, human ingenuity, and the enduring human desire to build something that will last. Thank you for watching.